Chance to me now to just officially welcome you to this event. My name is Deirdre Labassiere. I am the chair of the Lunar Society, and we're an organization of thought leaders, pioneers, and change makers who are advancing our mission to stimulate ideas, broaden debate, and catalyze action. So tonight, we're going to be discussing and debating recovery through change in business, in the context of the current environment that we're in. And I really, truly believe that we're going to have quite a lively debate that will touch, I expect, on COVID-19, of course. I expect that we'll probably also touch on Black Lives Matter, business growth, finance, and social impact and technology. We're honored to have with us a stellar panel whom Joel is going to go on to introduce, which is chaired by a premier business strategist, and I'm happy to call him friend as well, Joel Blake OBE, who, I don't know if this is a known fact, but Joel has spoken on the same stage as Bill Clinton. He is a self-confessed former inner city introvert. He says that he has bad glasses, and I suppose that's in that context, he refuses to conform to societal stereotypes. Joel is a multi-award winning entrepreneur, speaker, and facilitator, and we are honored that he is going to be chairing our event tonight. So I hand you over to your chair for the evening, Joel Blake.
Well, thank you, Deirdre, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for taking time out of your evening to be here. As for that Bill Clinton, it was well before his rather indiscretion activity, so it was an interesting time. But in terms of this evening, it's a wonderful opportunity for us to have a discussion and a debate around real premier issues that we are all going through. But from a more positive context, this discussion will be focused around what can we do, looking forward, progression, really looking towards that notion of recovery to change, because it is very clear that we're no longer working in the same way. And we also know that the normal, whatever that may be, will not be what we would expect. So this is an opportunity for us to have a very frank and open and honest debate regarding that. But ideally for us all to leave with some form of solution, actions, things that we can do, even in a small way, to bring about some of that change. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the stellar panel that we do have for this evening. And I'm just going to invite them all just to have around 7 minutes each to give a bit of an indication of who they are, what they do, and to just give their opening thoughts on this notion of recovery to change. After that, we will then go into some lively debate and we'll see where we go. So first and foremost, I would like to introduce Barbara Rainford. So Barbara, if you'd just like to just share who you are, what you do, and your thoughts on recovery to change.
Right. Hi, everyone. Forgive me reading this, but writing is my forte and not public speaking. So I'm not the only, thankfully, I'm not the only one who's nervous tonight. I think in what I've written does describe what I do as well. So I found the general feeling in the marketplace is uncertainty. There was a lot of uncertainty before COVID over Brexit, but now the impact of Brexit seems insignificant by comparison to COVID. I'm a director of BCRS, which is a community development finance institution, providing loans to businesses that are unable to obtain high street finance. They offer support and expert advice and work with accountants and business advisors to offer the right package to businesses. CBILS have been absolutely fantastic for helping larger businesses. And we found that businesses are trying to give themselves as many options as possible, and therefore are going for larger CBILS loans that they can use for working capital to allow them to survive for at least a year rather than for short-term loans. I've been a member of the Federation of Small Businesses since it started in 1974, and I now sit on the BEIS policy unit. For most FSB members, CBILS was not helpful at all, as their businesses are too small. There's lots of self-employed people and micro businesses, but the bounce back loans have been really useful and easy to apply for. Deferred VAT and tax payments have also been really helpful. I'm also an elected director of the biggest independent cooperative, Mid-Counties. The pandemic has made us all realise just how important people are. And this is something cooperatives have always known. Mid-Counties have paid key workers in retail stores extra wages during the pandemic, and many travel colleagues unable to work have transferred to help in the retail stores. Co-ops support the volunteer organisations in their local communities, and during the pandemic, these volunteers have been delivering shopping to vulnerable people. This is the way forward in business, working together. And the co-op strategy is survive, revive and thrive, and that's looking forward. I believe businesses in the future will have a more holistic view, with be more cooperative in terms of colleague participation rather than staff directives, with an understanding of the psychology of the workplace and being more community focused. There'll also be increased levels of automation, more sophisticated software, use of AI and robotics and big data, understanding customer needs. What would be helpful from the government is more certainty to enable planning. Sorry, such as what will happen to CBILS at the end of the 6 months. Is it going to be extended or replaced? And also there's likely to be a need for more affordable finance. So perhaps the government could make a pot of money available specific for CDFIs so they could offer loans to businesses at need at lower rates. The SITR, the Social Investment Tax Relief, also I feel should be extended after April 2021. Financial services have the opportunity to be the engine of recovery, helping businesses to understand and make use of new technologies, to reprioritise and refresh current strategies, and to emerge resilient, transforming lives for the better. I hope that was helpful.
That's brilliant. Thank you much, Barbara. And you know, you might be a little nervous, but don't be. You're amongst friends and family here, so try not to be too nervous. You pulled out a number of different elements there, which I think are really important, particularly around the connection between business and community, more than ever before. And I think that's an important point for us to maybe get into a bit of a discussion in afterwards. But on that community theme, I'd like to maybe move across to Munda. If you maybe like to introduce yourself, tell us a bit about what you do, and also your perspective on this recovery to change.
Yeah, sure, Joel. First of all, let me sort of thank Deirdre for the invitation to speak on the panel. I'm a member of the Lunar Society, and I have to say there seems to be a pattern emerging. I attended my first Lunar Society meeting a few weeks ago, and I found out that I taught the speaker, and I have to get Tina. I have to have another revelation, which always embarrasses Joel. I taught Joel's dad, and I have to say he was a much more receptive student than Joel. You probably gathered from that anecdote that I'm in the education field. I'm a professor of small business and the director for the Centre for Research in Ethnic Minority Entrepreneurship at Aston University. I've been so for about 30 years, researching small firms, but also trying to make a difference. And my interest is diversity and enterprise. But in my remarks, I'll draw on some of those, that academic background, but I'm going to rely heavily on my most important credentials as a Brummie. So what I want to highlight are 2 or 3 themes which I think are going to resonate and be amplified as a consequence of the existential changes that are happening. And I call them the 3 I's. The first one, of course, is inequality. And that's been thrown to the forefront by coronavirus and Black Lives Matter UK. I have to say there's a real connection between both, because on the receiving end of Black Lives Matter and coronavirus are minority communities. They have been at the forefront of quite an oppressive system, and it's coincidental, or is it coincidental that they've chimed together? But there's been another development in the environment which not many people have sort of noted, and that was the report very recently by the Social Mobility Commission, which highlighted the fact that social mobility, which had been improving, has stalled, effectively stalled over the last decade. And what all three tectonic changes highlight is that when we're talking about responses, our starting point shouldn't necessarily be about individual actions, important as they are. We need to focus on systemic change. I think the era of sticking plaster, amelioration, incremental change has gone. There's been a profound change, and it's being evidenced across society. So I think it's time to look at systems. When we look at them, though, we need to engage in a dialogue that is much more inclusive than hitherto has been the case. This is not it's government's responsibility on its own, or society's, or nebulous society's responsibility on its own, or business, or communities. There is some way we have to knit together a sort of collective response, and it has to be done in a deliberative way. We need to start talking to each other across boundaries, across communities, across sectors. We don't do that. And in some of these conversations I get involved, I've heard people say, we need to take action, we need to take action. I can really understand that sentiment. But I think equally, we need to honor the magnitude of the moment. There are profound changes that are going on. And if we don't respect or understand or try to make sense of those, we'll come up with piecemeal sticking plaster solutions. And on my last point in terms of inequality, as I said, it's not the responsibility of a single policy domain. It implicates us all. So that's the first I. The second is innovation. And I know this is dear to Joel's heart and a number of colleagues on the call. And when we talk about implement, this is kind of sort of lecturing habit. I'm tending to ask the audience, what do they mean by that? But
don't worry, I'm watching the time, Wanda.
Innovation. I'll quickly rattle through this then. You know, we've just done a major piece of work for the Federation of Small Businesses, which I can't talk too much about now, on minorities in business. And innovation comes to the fore, that we have it in our communities, but we don't recognize it as such. One of the things that we need, that has come to the fore in that research and in the crisis, is how paramount new thinking, new business models are. And sometimes we glibly say this, we need transformational change. I don't think it's an option now. It has become, we've got nothing to do, I think. I think serious responses require serious attention to innovation. But this innovation isn't the preserve of high-tech entrepreneurs. It's as much a feature of the novel interactions, the novel connections that we can generate and cultivate in communities too. Being innovative is not running a gazelle, a high-tech company, although Joel does that. But it's there in all of our communities. You can be innovative in the most difficult of circumstances, and we have sites of innovation all over this great city, but we don't recognize them as such, and they don't fit within our mainstream paradigms of what constitutes innovation and an ecosystem. And my final I is integration. Integration. When I talk about integration, I'm not talking about how do we integrate minorities into society. That's what I'm not talking about. It's much more profound and serious than that. one approach to integration is to really ask ourselves, what does success look like in a business sense? Is it running a high-tech company? Is it profit maximization? Is it wealth generation? Or is it bringing communities together? Why don't we value the social contribution of businesses? The Federation of Small Businesses did a brilliant report on the social value that micro businesses generate. But I bet you look at all the grand sounding industrial strategies and the notion of inclusive growth, that social contribution is missed. And the same applies to what, household relationships. The success of a spouse depends on the hidden contribution of others. And we don't recognize that. We eulogize one, and that often takes male form, but we don't recognize the other. And I think what the crisis has showed is that collision of those boundaries between home and work has happened. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to recreate the same set of relationships? Are we going to take the opportunity to reflect? And my final point is, my final point, with some audience, unanticipated audience participation, is the sort of changing sort of structure or approach to well-being that we need to integrate that into all of our domains, including work. And we need to incentivize that in the workplace, not because it's going to contribute solely to the bottom line, but that should be the defining feature of what a good society looks like. Thank you very much.
And Amanda, that's a fantastic point to lead us into a quick debate and interaction from us all before I introduce Nicola and Sultan. But I think what you've highlighted there, Amanda, is a really good, an important input on the importance of value and what does value really mean to us now in terms of societal value, business value, community value, and how do these things interplay? So that's the question I maybe like to ask the whole audience here. Please feel free to unmute yourself if you wish to say something, or slightly raise your hand. I am looking to see in order of who's raising as well. But I'd like to pose the question, what does value mean to you in this current time? And that's the question I'd like to pose. So who would like to answer?
Can I make a comment at this point?
Yeah, please, Stuart, please do.
I am a person who likes to think I am helping other people. I'm an environmental consultant. I do not rip off other people, which many environmental consultants do. Some of the big firms just take huge amounts of money away. I like to think that also we should give as much as we can to other charities. And I'm a Rotarian, and therefore, if you know what a Rotarian is like, they do get nothing but satisfaction from helping other people. And I think if we all try to help other people, we would end up with a fair society.
Thank you for your comments, Stuart. And I think that's absolutely right. Surely life is about that human connection between us as people, regardless of difference. And I think somewhere in all the challenge and the turbulence that we're going through, we've actually missed that sense of connection. But then on the flip side, one would argue that COVID-19 has allowed us to have greater connection, albeit digitally. So to what extent is maybe digital technology helping us to make that connection? But Steve, can I just come to you very quickly in terms of art and the kind of ethos behind what you do, because the essence of value and helping others seems to be at the heart of your business.
Yeah, thanks very much, Joel. Steve Walker, I'm Chief Executive of Art Business Loans. We're like BCRS. In fact, we founded BCRS, so therefore, basically, I've got to say, we're older than BCRS, and we were founded by Sir Adrian Cadbury and myself 22 years ago. But picking up Monda, who was a director of Art Business Loans, the social value of the loans we do, we only lend money, like BCRS, when the bank has actually declined. And the interesting thing, looking back now over the last few years, since the the crash is that we found that the gaps which are supposed to be filled by alternative lenders like the funding circles and everything, the gaps are still there, because in actual fact, those peer lenders and alternative lenders have actually just competed with the banks, where we lend actually when the banks aren't lending. So we're really attacking markets that are underserved and are still underserved. We had a record year last year, and for me, the interesting, listen, you asked the question about value. We went out to try and raise more money because we thought there was going to be a bigger demand, and BCRS did the same, but we did it a different way. We went out to individuals and companies to try and raise money. And it was, the last 2 years have been bitterly disappointing, I have to say, because it was really, really difficult to raise money, particularly in Birmingham. To actually, there's certain individuals who did put their hand in their pocket, and certain who got behind us and said, we recognise it. But it was more difficult 22 years on than it was when Sir Adrian and I went out as a startup and raised £350,000 from companies. We didn't raise a penny from companies this time. And
why do you think that is, Steve? Why do you think that's been so difficult now?
Well, in actual fact, Stuart might have mentioned one of the things there that's relevant. There's a lot of alternative ways in which people are pulling on the money from corporates. And basically, if you're actually looking at charities, for example, we're not a charity, we have charitable purposes. We're a social enterprise. But at the end of the day, charities, there could be, for example, cancer research, it could be Children's Hospital, all those will pull on the charities. And the companies who are successful and want to give back actually say to their staff, what do you want to do? Do you want to actually invest in a social enterprise? What's that? That invests in small businesses in the local economy and underserved areas? Or do you want to invest in the local children's hospital? And that is an issue for corporates. But for individuals, I think, you know, the wider, and that's why, I mean, I'm a member of the Lunar Society. That's why I'm attracted to the Lunar Society, because it's basically what I'm looking for is people who are actually wanting that social purpose with their money, to use that money to invest it in a certain way. I think now is a challenge, and in terms of recovery, it's a challenge now for the simple reason that who knows what's going forward if we invest in small businesses. Many of the small businesses we invest in are actually shut at the moment, and we don't know when they're going to open. Please reduce it to 1 metre. That's what I'd end at the moment.
Well, you know, you make a really good point there, Steve, in terms of corporate value and social value and the education of both, because not all sides understand all sides in that context. But I think within that, it also ends to the fact that as we go through this stage of recovery towards growth and beyond, that still will be defined and redefined as people get used to their own sense of the new normal. And I say that broadly because that has a different impetus depending on how you're looking at that, whether it's a social normal, corporate normal, or just as an individual. So I think understanding what your values are and being centered around that is going to be even more important, but it's the adaptability and the flexibility to operate from that position in a new world. And I think that's going to be a challenge for an individual, communities and business. But on that point, I'd just like to maybe just introduce in Nicola Fleet Mill, because I think, Nicola, from your perspective, I think business is a really, really important part. I'd be interested to get your perspective on recovery to change.
Hi, everybody. So I'm Nicola Fleet Milne, and I kind of wear two hats. So my first hat is that I am a small business owner. I own a letting and estate agency in the city centre in Birmingham, up on Colmore Row. Been going for 16 years. And whilst I think when Deirdre asked me to be part of this, she said be a representative for the SME, but I don't even think I tick that box, sorry. I think I'm considered a micro business because there are only 14 of us, but you know, we do okay. So my second hat is that I'm the chair of Colmore Business District. So on that side, we represent 650 different businesses across city centre. So they're mainly professional, but there are quite a lot of hospitality and leisure as well. And so actually wearing those two different hats change the sort of recovery through change is actually slightly different for each of those, because so if I take my own business, for example, 14 people, how I deal with change is very personal in my business. I kind of took a look at my team at the very beginning and thought, I have nowhere to hide, but I have no excuses about not thinking about each single one of them individually. With 14 people, you cannot say, oh, I couldn't possibly have made the right decision for you all. Whereas with CBD, I can't make decisions that will affect 650 businesses and that they'll all be happy with it. So yeah, it's been quite interesting. So recently, obviously, the government announced that we would be able to come back to work and we could open and we could do in-person viewings of properties. However, at the same time, the government said, if you can do your job from home, you should. And we had managed by that point 11 weeks of working perfectly well from home. All properties had been, we've got video tours. So we'd been able to let property still and transact and function throughout the lockdown without actually leaving home. So we had a little bit of a quandary with that. However, having surveyed my entire team, it became very clear that whilst we can survive as a business working from home, that's very different when it comes down to people's mental health. And last week we had a couple of people came into the office just to start testing things and trialing how it would work. And the happiness on people's faces because they'd seen another human being for the first time. And it wasn't just somebody anonymous to them. It was someone they knew about, they cared about, and they wanted to interact with. So whilst I accept that technically I could enforce all of my team staying at home because they can still transact from there, actually the decision has been made by the whole team to bring everybody back into the office in a staged fashion, slowly but surely, because they want to work together again. They want to see each other. And that doesn't mean that those little innovations that we've made during lockdown are not going to stay. I love change. I absolutely love change. And it sounds a really, really awful thing to say, but when this all kicked off, I was a little bit excited because so much was going to change. And this was my opportunity. I was going to make them all use Microsoft Teams. That was wonderful. And they've been resisting it for at least the last year. And also, I felt that we spent too much time showing people around when they were basically window shopping. So the innovation of being able to do video tours and to qualify better, these are, like Monda said earlier, they're small, they're tiny little things, but they're going to make the world of difference to my team and my business. And, you know, they're the world to us. They are, you know, it's not going to change the entire world. We're not going to completely revamp property, but we're going to chip away at that and come up with new ways. And then just on the other side, under CBD, that's been really interesting as well, because obviously people, like I said earlier, there are 650 businesses of such varying sizes. You know, we have KPMG, we have PwC, we have, I don't know, Ernst & Young, they're huge, huge companies. And they are, I don't think this is a massive secret, but they've basically said, you know, us coming back into the city, that the social distancing and the in and out of each of our buildings could mean that getting into the building takes you over an hour. And therefore, it is not sensible for us to rush back to the city. Now, that has a direct impact on the coffee shops, on the small supermarkets, on the restaurants, the bars. You know, people aren't going to be going for networking lunches if they're not going to be working in the city centre. So we have to listen to both sides of that and try and work with our huge companies, but also with our very small companies to make sure that we're coming up with innovations that work. And the one that we've come up with so far is about virtual queuing, which for any of you who've headed down to London and ever done the virtual queuing, which is becoming quite popular down there, this isn't something that's been quite as adopted in Birmingham, but it's a really good idea, because rather than go out in your lunch hour and queue for an hour, why not pre-order your food, go to whichever restaurant or coffee bar it is and collect it and then bring it back? You win, they win, you know. And actually, I think this is a way that we can make sure that some of those businesses I want them to survive. It's really, really important, because the world is very, very boring if it's just lots of glass offices. You know, we need all those tiny little independences, interesting places that you pop at lunch. We need those there. So really for me, I suppose, there's been innovation. It's not always grand innovation. Like, you know, like Wanda said, we're not completely reinventing things, but we are tweaking things that are going to make life an awful lot easier for a lot of companies, and hopefully they will all survive as well.
That's brilliant, Nicola, because I think, again, as much as innovation and technology may be challenging for some, natural to others, we are living in the world where technology is a natural part of our lives and will continue to be so.
Yeah.
And in this time of recovery to change and whatever the new normal is, we have to be willing to adapt ourselves to that, or else we will be the ones that will be behind, whether that's as an individual, as a business, community, etc. I've noted a number of questions in the chat. They are being monitored. We'll have an opportunity to go through them shortly. But what I like to do is just to switch over to Sultan, because on that technology theme, Sultan, I understand that from your expertise in your area, would it be fair to say you're a bit of an advocate for technology as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So just a bit of background about myself. So I'm a Midland through and through, really. Grew up in a place called Dudley, not very far from Birmingham. And my claim to fame is really, I haven't met Bill Clinton or presented alongside him, but my claim to fame is I grew up in the same street as Lenny Henry, who you might know. And, you know, I've been interested in technology from a pretty young age, and worked with lots of different types of organizations. And currently my role is at PwC, where I'm a partner looking after intelligent automation across UK and EMEA. And what that means is that we're helping businesses make better use of technologies such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, new ways of working, and so forth. I've tended to work across many industries, but a lot of my work has been in financial services. And, you know, if you look at, for example, financial services, there's probably about 500,000 employees in the UK employed by banking and capital markets types of organizations. And we did a piece of research which said, you know, out of those employees, how many actually require physical contact with customers and so forth. And our analysis kind of said that 30% of employees typically have physical contact in their day-to-day work. And then we obviously all experienced the surreal world of COVID and you know, coronavirus and working from home. And you know, we found that 82% of financial services employees can actually work from home, and most financial services organizations, and I guess it's probably similar in others, but most financial services organizations hadn't really thought this was even possible. They hadn't even thought, is this way of working could actually work, and some of them were so pleasantly surprised that actually the technology held up well, and they were able to continue the majority of their operations. So FS companies and banks have an important role to play in terms of helping society and organizations through this crisis. And we asked the general public what they thought the bank's role should be, and 83% of people we surveyed said banks have a moral obligation to help businesses through this crisis. And so this is an opportunity for banks to basically improve the level of trust they hold within society, and help organizations through these challenging times. Now, we also help a lot of companies come out of the crisis as well. So we as PwC work with all kinds of companies to help them manage what we call back to work green light project. And what we're finding is that, you know, what organizations thought was important to them before coronavirus is no longer the same. So what's important now is different to what was important, you know, only 3 months ago. So an example might be, you know, they might have thought it's important to, maybe increase office space, or it's important to invest in some sort of machinery. But what they're now kind of thinking is the most important thing for them is digitization, because we are now much more in the digital world going forward. So banks are reprioritizing, and it's not just banks, I'm seeing this across many industries. They're reprioritizing what they're investing in. And digitization is what they're accelerating. They're accelerating the move to digitization. The second thing they're accelerating is customer engagement. So the way customers were being interfaced with in the past is no longer the way forward. So how to engage customers in this world, in the world of social distancing, in the world of customers, in the world of Zoom, in the world of all these kind of new technologies which have taken off. So customer engagement is a big priority for a lot of organizations, and that applies to banks. It applies to motor manufacturers. In fact, I had to book my car in for a service recently, and that was an experience, because there's a lot of things that that organization could learn from in terms of customer engagement in a digital age. So they're prioritizing those two things around digitization, around customer engagement. But the third pillar that's I'm noticing, and we're noticing within PwC, that's really taking off, is what I call employee upskilling and employee engagement. So a lot of organizations are realizing that the role people used to do in the past is not going to be the role in the future. They are going to introduce more and more digitization and automation, so that the mundane activities that people were doing, the things that we as humans are not really designed to do, and we go to work and do them, we no longer have to do them. But that means we have to upskill the employees. We have to give them new skills. So there's a massive amount of investment, thought, and training going on in how do you improve the skills that your employees have, and how do you give them the roles that they value going forward as well. So that's another big change that I think is going to hit us over the next few months. So I think we asked and as part of PwC, as a partner in PwC, we have obligations to our staff, and each of the partners has to kind of make sure all our staff are well and coping with this kind of new environment. And one of the things I had to do, for example, was to ring the people that work with me and to understand their views on returning back to work. And you can imagine that in PwC there's 20,000 employees, so that's a big data source in terms of getting views of all the different employees. And we found that 90+% of employees don't think they will return to work as pre-coronavirus. They will come to work, but how they work, maybe turn up to work for important meetings, maybe turn up to work for things that can't be done remotely. But generally, the way people work is going to change dramatically. And then that touches on the inequality point as well, because it's easy to work from home if you've got the facilities, you've got the equipment, you've got the a separate room and so on. And a lot of our staff might not necessarily have that. We employ a lot of graduates, a lot of people living in shared flats and so on. And so we've also said we've embarked on basically the ability for staff to get better equipment in their home so they can actually work more effectively. So, you know, a lot of simple things like, you know, a stand for your desktop so you don't get backache when when you're doing too many Zoom conferences. To basically, you know, headphones and microphones where people necessarily can't use the speaker and the PC because they're sharing the flat with a load of others. So those are things that I think are pretty important, and I absolutely, you know, get the 3 I's that was being talked about earlier.
Absolutely.
But I would say, you know, diversity is a really, really strong point in being able to overcome these challenges.
Well, Sultan, I'm just going to stop you there only because with that diversity point, I think diversity is something that's going to go across everything that people have said so far today. And I think there's some things around the diversity of thought and the values that we all hold as individuals. Certainly the diversity and the contribution of different people and different communities, but there's also diversity within diversity, which creates even more complexity.
Yeah.
And then obviously we've talked about business and the importance of businesses themselves getting access to the support that they need to help other businesses, going back to Steve's point around better access to finance so they can do more of what they do well, as well as other organizations, clearly BCRS, FSB as support organizations. But kind of coming to the latter points around innovation and technology, it strikes me that the adoption of technology, it's already happened and it's going to happen at an even faster rate.
Absolutely.
And the diversity within how you do that and how you use technology is also going to increase.
Yeah.
And for me, that's a point I'd like to stay on as we jump into the questions for all of you. Because there's been a number of questions that I've seen in the chat, and just following it through, I think there seems to be a theme emerging around this aspect of people. You know, how do you respond to the environment? How do you make sure technology can help your people better, etc.? So what I like to do is just maybe whiz back up to the top of some of the early questions that came through. But this is for everyone to interact and to give your views and opinions on what you're hearing and the questions that you'll be hearing in a moment. And we have about 30 minutes of a Q&A interactive session now. So please feel free to chime in when you wish. As I say, just put yourself off on mute, raise your hand, use one of the reactions if you want to speak, but obviously the chat is still here if you want to put your question in there. So just going back to the top, one of the first questions that came out was from Ibrahim, who was asking about how does technology affect the proposed values mentioned by yourself, Monda? And secondly, how does the adaptive psychology of social distancing affect the way in which humans interact with each other in business, more specifically? So technology and values, Monda, if I can maybe pass that to you, and maybe Sultan, if you have an angle on that as well. Monda.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I mean, technology is a neutral phenomenon, but the value to the use to which it's put can be positive, but it can be malign as well. I mean, I thought Nicola's and Sultan's presentations were excellent, really, in sort of highlighting the positive ways in which technology can be used to facilitate engagement and inclusivity. And there might be, in Nicola's case, an example from a small firm, but I think it's a really powerful example of what something really tangible and yet and at the same time profound can happen when you think in a sort of holistic way that Nicola did. So I think there's really positives that can be gained from technology, and you know, in research that my colleagues have done, if micro businesses want to be productive, technology is the way to go. They don't utilize it to the same degree as other firms, but that's the way to go. At the same time, technology can also have consequences too. And there's a stack of research that shows that technology is both gendered and racialized. And the way it's used, for example, to sift out candidates in the recruitment process and the algorithms that are used are discriminatory. And so I think we need to be really, really careful to look at the to look at the way technology is utilized, the motivations and the structures that can be either harnessed to facilitate integration or in a subtle way to undermine it.
Great answer. And I think it's quite very interesting because as much as I, myself run a technology company, it's the social impact of what technology can do that I find really most important. I think technology is certainly an enabler. It's not all about the technology in itself, but it's been very clear on the aspect of why and how it needs to be used. Sorry, Nicola, you had a point to make?
I was actually just going to say that I agree that there's essentially there's you're looking for a balance between these things. It's the it's that utopian word balance again, that we're always all searching for the perfection, but ultimately tech is great, but it must take into consideration people. People working from home will be lonely, and tech really can only go so far in terms of making people feel included. I completely accept that there's a whole generation who probably weren't as tech savvy, who all of a sudden do feel included at the moment, which is wonderful. And I apologise, I can't remember who asked the question, but somebody did ask earlier, how do we make sure people then don't become tech excluded? So there's a real sort of question. Thanks, Vicky. There's a real question of how do you balance that, the tech and the people, and then really on Monda's point that tech for bad. I confess, totally ignorant. I did not know that there's tech out there that discriminates, and I'm not entirely sure why I'd want it to discriminate. But actually, therefore, surely there must be the opposite too, or there can be the opposite, which is if we know that exists, then let's change that tech to make it non-discriminatory for good, so that actually, how do I, I know I have. I now have conscious biases, which I used to be unconscious of, and I have more females in my business than I have males. And I apologise for that. Literally once a year on the 8th of March, I'm a hero, but the rest of the year, I'm really not getting that balance correct. But actually, maybe I need some of that tech to help me stop only interviewing females for jobs. So I'd like to see the tech for bad swapped over to be tech for good, because it must exist, or it must be possible to innovate it.
Interesting point. A very interesting point. Peter, I know you had your hand up through that discussion. So is there something you want to share?
Well, first of all, I think it's a brilliant summary of all the speakers are brilliant. The one thing, Nicola's, I think, very much on cue here, because at the end of the day, we need to have a human element to all change. There's an element of, we can talk about change and all this, but we sometimes lose sight of the human element of it. And I think we've got to also concentrate. We are talking about change, but we've got to know what we've got to come away from and what we're going to. That would then represent the change that we'd achieve. I think, in a way, I like the human element of life in general, and I think that's actually the most important part that we should play in this change process. Thank you.
Really, really great point there, Peter. Deirdre?
Thanks, Joel. Excellent panel of speakers. You've all been fantastic. Thank you so much. But I just wanted to make the point that I think even behind the will to diversify and to have meaningful diversity, we need to make sure that the people who are governing their organizations have those structured frameworks, and it means that they have to think really meaningfully, and then they have to engage with stakeholders and a diverse set of stakeholders in an honest and transparent way, so that they can feed into what it is that they're seeking to achieve, and make sure that they're acting for the benefit, not just of their own organization, but for society as a whole. So I just think that it's just very, very important that those foundational structures are in place, those frameworks are clear and defined, but then there's room for flexibility in relation to change, to embrace change, and to develop the organizations and society.
But Deirdre, I mean, that's absolutely a very important point, because we often forget the foundations. You know, sometimes change happens so quickly to us, we just have to just jump on the bus and go. We often forget the foundations that made that change even possible, as an evolutionary activity. And it kind of links to Maria's question in the chat, where she's asked, are there any innovative developments emerging in terms of engaging with staff and managing virtual cultures, or is it just too early to say? And I think it's a really important point, you know, just related to what you said there. So, I mean, anyone's got any thoughts on that in terms of innovative developments to help effectively develop the same and even better cultures through the better engagement of staff?
It's a really kind of, it's probably a really basic version, but when lockdown started, you saw an explosion of various technologies or platforms for people getting together virtually. So House Party, Zoom, Teams, things that we hadn't used before. They're the seeds, aren't they? They're the very start of it all. But now how do you take it that little bit further to make it, I guess we're all sat here right now and everyone's face is right here and we're all staring at one another, and that's not natural. If you have a conversation with a friend, you don't stare at your friend's face. So I guess there's a way to start developing these things to make people feel that they can develop culture without feeling like they're being watched as such. So I think there's probably some way that they can take those things forward and you know, develop them further.
So I'm going to go to Sultan and then Steve, and then I'm going to move the subject on. But Sultan, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just to add to that point, you know, 3 months ago, I wouldn't have known how do you have a beer party using Zoom, you know. You know, you know, staff are very creative. So, you know, we've had all kinds of drinks, meetings, beer parties, those kind of things. The thing we found is that, you know, with this world of webcam, you can get back-to-back meetings and you tend to lose your social time. And therefore you have to actually program in social time where you can have those kind of relaxed, you know, discussions, human interaction and so on, where you're not talking about work. You know, one of the feedback we've had is, you know, people used to use commute time as downtime. Now they don't have that. They just, you know, wake up, have breakfast, go into the next video conference and then back to back. So it's really important to program this in deliberately. Otherwise we lose an important point here.
Absolutely. Steve?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think one of the, definitely from personal experience, of sort of an hour driving in from Solihull to Birmingham each day, it's a wonderful downtime to talk to people on the phone and chat and think about things. But at the end of the day, I think one of the things that I would say that in that last part of the discussion, and I agree with what Nicola said, but I would actually sort of say there is a difference between the small and the micro, and now you know you're small, Nicola, you're all right. The small and the micro businesses and how they engage in that sort of community sort of area and actually know what's going on. I mean, my concern in terms of, I know I'm the Access to Finance sort of champion in that respect, and together with BCRS, but a lot of people don't know what's available. They still don't know. And how do they actually get to know that, for example, there are helpful groups or helpful corporates that can help them to basically succeed in what they want to do? Because engaging with those, and the one thing I'm going to end on is to say that what we're facing at the moment is a totally different circumstance to 2008. We're basically a situation now where people, and especially the small businesses, their first indication at the moment is recovery. They're basically looking, how do we recover from where we are and how do we go forward? Change will form part of that, it's got to, and technology will form part of it. But it's recovery and survival And those are the two most important words on most of the small businesses' lips at the moment. Survival, which wasn't necessarily there before.
Well, Steve, you know, that's such a really important point, because whilst there's a lot of things going on in the world, it's the day-to-day experience of the business, the individual on the ground, and particularly those who have much of a social focus who might be hit the hardest. And in particular charities who have been set up for those purposes. Which brings me to Tina's question that she sent in previously, where she asked, you know, many charities are now rethinking about their service and business models as traditional methods of operating are becoming unsustainable. So what do we all think that charities should be thinking about or doing differently to maintain their financial viability? And I think that's a really powerful question that she asked, actually, because, you know, charities and many businesses in that social sector have been challenged for years. It's a cultural challenge, getting financially sustainable. So with all the change that's happening at a macro level, even across more established sectors, how do we think charities should be thinking in order to remain financially viable? So anyone got any thoughts on that?
I think they need to be closer to businesses. And I think there has to be a more joined up culture. And I think that's what will arise from a lot of this crisis, that people will have to start working together in a much more unified way. So it won't be like businesses, then charities, then education. The whole thing should meld together. That's what I think could be a good outcome.
And there has been some new funding for certain social businesses, such as citizen law centres, for those that can't afford expensive legal bills, for example. So people are actually fronting up and understanding that inequality means that people are disadvantaged in that way and need help asserting their rights. So I think there are interesting new sources of central funding that's coming through where need is recognised.
But do you think, Megan, that the actual funding providers are, sounds slightly controversial, but do you think they're really taking on board the actual needs of charities and organisations on the ground? And do you think they're close enough to that, you know, daily impact that they're going through?
No, I don't think they are, but I think things like legal aid and things have been under threat for decades now, and there is a portion of society that really struggles to get access to legal support to address some of the inequalities in the world. And I think perhaps with pressure of Black Lives Matter and other organisations, the domestic violence bill, for example, that's going through, there seems to be a bit of a national recognition that we can't allow the inequalities to continue as they are. Now, I'm not suggesting that state funding is the long-term future for any of this, but it's an interesting change of national mood.
No, it's a really valid point. Peter, I see you had your hand up, sir.
Am I unmuted?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, very good. So I was at one stage known as merger mayor in the charitable sector, and that's partly why I asked the question about what is small. I mean, clearly there are viability issues in focusing too small, again, whatever that means, and this notion of working together, which is, I suppose, been my lifelong sort of aim, is that organisations and charities, because the original question was about charities, and I was saying to you, I formed Age UK Birmingham at one stage, is their focus on what they think is the need, often without the technology behind that, to really justify their own focus. So consortia working together, and I'll pick up, Stuart mentioned Rotary. Well, there was an international president of Rotary from South Korea who talked about the good heart and saying all business, and I include charities and small businesses, need to work on the principle which goes back to, I think, Joel, what you said earlier, of are we actually adding value to this society by working in the way we do and producing the product we do? And you know, the definition of customer is difficult within this. We haven't talked about that, but actually, whose need are we looking at? So I'd say micro businesses have to work with other micro businesses or small businesses to understand and be successful in the sectors they're working in.
Thank you for your comment, Peter, and you're absolutely right. I agree on the, merger mayor. I like that. Sorry, but I agree. You can't miss out on the importance of customers and the understanding around how we make these better connections in those ways. But that being said, I'm kind of bringing in Connor's question here in terms of the reevaluation of financial resilience of companies. And again, just taking on, I guess, your merger experience, Peter, in terms of how do we really evaluate how do you articulate what a financial resilient business looks like in this world now that we're in, and will that change in the future? I think is where I'm asking the question really, but using Connor's question there around, will the 2020 crisis result in a reevaluation of the financial resilience of companies? Interesting. What does a valuable, successful business really look like in the new world?
More compassionate, I would hope.
Yeah, we'd hope so.
But you're also you've got to split that up, because I keep reading about the bad bank and equity, and this is going to be the saviour. Well, that has always been the case, and people have muted it, but not for small, medium-sized businesses that basically have not just been profitable and are going through difficult times. Nobody's going to put equity into those. They're going to put equity into the high growth ones as they ever have. And so it's going to be the larger businesses, that the equity side. And the danger, and you touched on an interesting point early on about charities, and sort of saying that government have got to do things. I see one of the questions meant government. We haven't touched on the fact that, one of the things I was going to say tonight, and I'll say it now because I think it's the right time to say it. I mean, the whole of this is we've rested on national government. What's happened to devolution? What's happened to localised things? Because nothing's happened locally. Everything's been done to us by national. I mean, the Treasury have taken over the British Business Bank, which they kept at arm's length, said we'll make the decisions, and that's what's happened. So therefore, if we don't change that and get some hold of what's happening locally, we'll never be able to do what Nicola's just suggested and sort of bring, and Monda I know is keen on, bring in micro businesses to talk to each other, and basically in groups that they can learn off each other, because basically we'll have lost the opportunity, and all we're doing is sitting back waiting for a handout from national government, which will or will not come. And I would end on one point. The Bounce Back Loan Scheme, which has been much well received, is the first time in living history where you'll see the banks been allowed to say that they're not actually responsible for basically the lending decision. The lending decision is the responsibility of the borrower on a bounce back loan, and they self-certify it. It shouldn't have been loans, it should have been grants.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not going to get into that. That's a really, really valid point, because at some point it has to get paid back. That's a challenge. Deirdre, I know you had your hand up, and Monda as well, and Tina. So if I could just go to you in that order. Deirdre.
Thanks, Joel. No, I actually, Steve really very succinctly made some of the points that I was going to make, but because I've been working with both small and large businesses, and what I've seen is that the large businesses who frankly had their houses in order and who have, who have the framework and the profitability behind them, the banks aren't afraid to lend to them. So, so nothing's changed drastically. They've moved a few things about. They've had to deal with some metrics, but other than that, nothing's changed. But with the small businesses, they've kind of been left in the ether, and they're scrounging and trying to find viable finance, or trying to be innovative with the way that they're going to get that finance. So I think that there has to be an education as well to support the small businesses in relation to this. And we need, like Steve said, I mean, it's like things have just been done to us. We haven't had that engagement at local level. And that...
Oops. That's it.
Cheers, John. Thank you. Now, thanks, Deirdre, for your comment. Absolutely valid point. Munda?
I think Connor has raised an excellent point in the chat about taking a stake, equity. And I think it's really important because, again, if we sort of reflect, what institution has sort of ensured that we've survived the health crisis, and that's the NHS. Before anyone says Matt Hancock, what institution has sort of helped us, helped industry to survive, and that's government taking a stake. And so, what institution, if we're genuinely talking about an inclusive response, is best placed to facilitate a recovery? And maybe now is the time to think about something quite radical, with government taking a stake, not nationalizing stuff, but taking an intelligent stake in key sectors, which would promote a longer term inclusive recovery. I mean, this argument has been made by Mariana Mazzucato in The Value of Everything, her most recent book. And she talks about it in the case of larger firms and large segments of industry. But I think something that would be absolutely sort of fascinating to look at, and this touches upon Steve's point, is that, if we really believe in devolution and the importance of regional economic development, etc., there are really excellent local institutions that are very close to firms. I mean, like ART, for example, and they know which firms will survive and won't. And what scope is there for the principle of equity in both senses of the word, i.e. cash, but also fairness, to be a part of an economic process of economic recovery, which applies to small and large firms equally?
I think there's a real strong economic conversation around that very point, which probably won't have enough time to have tonight, but certainly, if the government did play a part in that, then there's definite new mechanisms that might need to be developed, etc., to ensure that the equity journey is being measured and they are being held accountable for playing their part as well. But Tina, in terms of, I know you had your hand up as well, so I don't know if you've got a point.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to all the speakers. It's been really stimulating. And thank you, Nicola. I'm not on a guilt trip anymore because I work in health, and I was feeling, and I know it's been devastating health-wise, it's been a terrible crisis, but I was also excited about the change because we've put in place in charity and in health things that we really should have put in place years ago as a result. But in answer to your question, Joel, I see the, I suppose, the recovery and the sustainability and resilience in two levels. One is a different approach to competition. And thinking about competition in a very different way, very much as Monda was saying about real integration, because we've seen a lot of very unusual types of integration and organisations coming together. And Monda, you've almost stole my thunder as well in the answer to your question, and about a much stronger relationship and integration between business and health. Because research is showing that we've gone through a national trauma with COVID-19. The change that has happened there's been a lot of great change invoked, but the change has also been sudden and traumatic for a large part of the population. So as we come out of change, it's going to be very important that we take account of the post-traumatic impact that this has had on us nationally. And that really needs to be built within our business models in order that we don't default to a position where we think great productivity, we can have Zoom after Zoom after Zoom, and rather look at what will sustain people's well-being, and also not only business recovery, but personal recovery from the trauma, because that will also sustain economic recovery if we take account of the potential damage that has been done, because people are going to be behaving in very different ways, thinking in different. I already find that I'm forgetting things because things have changed so different so much that I notice little changes in myself, and you think actually that's a bit of a sign of a trauma there. And so it's really important that we don't ignore that as we move into restoration, recovery and innovation going forward.
Absolutely, totally concur with that. And I think it was a point that you made in your introduction, Manda, in terms of the importance of well-being, and just making sure that we are taking care of ourselves and those whom are in our immediate and extended circles as well, because that sense of well-being is going to be the thing that enables people to feel that they can still continue to be the best they can be, to deliver in their roles, to be the best mothers, fathers, sons, daughters, etc. So I think there's certainly something we need to really consider at the very heart of all this change. So just being conscious of the time, we've got about 15 minutes. So what I like to do is just to start to think about final thoughts. So the speakers yourselves, I'll be coming back to you shortly, with just kind of your final thoughts on what you've heard this evening, and maybe just some insight, words of wisdom, however you wish to share those final thoughts. But for everybody else, what I'd like to maybe just to pose as a final question really is, what do you think you need to change in order to respond to the change? So what is it that you think you need to change in order to respond to the change? And I'll keep it as broad as that, because that might relate to you in different ways. But what do you need to change in order to respond to the change?
Do you want us to answer this? You're writing it down.
No, you're not allowed to answer it, Nicola, not yet. but those who, obviously audience on the call, what is it you need to change to respond to the change? You might need to change anything at all. It's just a question.
I think you have to influence other people to change, Joel. I think some of the things you have to do yourself, but I mean, one of the things I would say, and I think Barbara might agree with me, is there's an inequality, picking up one of Manda's words, in that the banks can get money from the Bank of England and the government at 0.1% to do things, and basically that money can't be available to the wider alternative finance sector. So I'd love to think that basically one of the things that we could do together, and I'm talking to BCRS very regularly about it, is change that thinking. And Steve Deacon and I have already written a paper on it, so we're hoping that we can get the money at 0.1%, which would make a difference.
Well, whilst that's a very financial view and a very business view, Steve, which are absolutely relevant.
Oh, there's more access then. More access then.
It's absolutely needed, Steve. But I think, I think one of the things, and in going to the panelists just to get your final thoughts, I think one of the things what I've certainly heard so far is the importance of connecting personally to this change, and whether that's personally but with your work hat on, or personally as an individual, it's this whole crisis and the things that are happening globally are certainly affecting our outlook to a degree. And so there's a certain level of internal, I think someone's put in the chat, adaptability, Ibrahim, yeah, absolutely. A certain level of adaptability and flexibility that we need to adopt as individuals in order to be the leaders that we can within our roles, whatever roles they are. Just a personal opinion, but I think there's something in that. So just to kind of round off and finish off, if I go back to the beginning, and Barbara, just in terms of what you've heard this evening, your thoughts, I'd just like to get a, as I say, a final thought from you in terms of recovery to change.
Right. looking back at your last question as well, I was thinking, what has changed? I think people have got a lot more aware. When you look at social media, everybody's talking about gardening and being able to hear the birds, and I think there's a much bigger awareness of what's really important in life. Looking back on what's been said tonight, innovation, I think, is going to be really important. Necessity is the mother of invention. We had more innovations during the war than ever because we needed them. So I think that's going to happen. And the other things that have been mentioned tonight, bringing communities together, people, the emphasis on people and working together.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Barbara. And you're right. I think if I'm hearing correctly, at the heart of all those elements is that power of innovation, but understanding what that means, innovation in our relationships, innovation in our organizations, in our community, innovation as individuals. So thank you for sharing that. Monda, if I can come to you in terms of your kind of final thought.
Just two thoughts. I mean, at a sort of more societal level, I suppose change and broaden the metrics by what we mean by success. Is it wealth creation, wealth generation, or is it human flourishing? And on a more personal level, I think, do what I can to facilitate or convene spaces where people can have conversations like this, free from the institutional affiliation, and just connect as humans and, see and just, I suppose, create a conversation around what would a human-centered response look like. Thanks.
That's a very interesting point. What would a human centered? I think, again, that's a question we can't necessarily answer now, but it's a very, very powerful one. Because I think within your points earlier around diversity and inclusion and inequality, and again, looking at a recent comment there in the chat, all that creates a level of diversity, which then will create a very wide range of views on what a human-centered approach would mean. But it certainly would also mean that as with technology, it's humans who create the technology, it's humans who create the action, it's humans who do the doing. So that diversity of thought is actually an advantage if we harness it correctly, and if we give it the opportunity to add that sustainable value. But that diversity and readdressing inequality certainly plays a huge part into that. If I can go to Nicola in just terms of, again, your final thoughts for this evening.
A word that got used very early on in all of this, and I was quite surprised to see that it didn't get used again, is resilience. And I've found that through all of this, the way that people have changed, the way that processes have changed, the way that health, both physical and mental, have changed, has really kind of shown people that resilience isn't just about finance. It isn't just about whether the business survives. It's that human piece that everyone keeps talking about. Your team are your resilience, but also their resilience is partly your responsibility. We all have to be there and listen. We're probably going to listen a lot more now than we would have done 4 months ago if someone had been trying to voice either a mental health issue or a diversity issue. I just think we're in a much stronger place now, and I'd like to see a lot more resilience going forward.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nicola. Again, absolute valid point in terms of resilience. As we all know, as professionals and as individuals and what we all do, we have to have thick skin to keep going, particularly when we're coming from a place of wanting to evoke or at least be part of change. And so resilience is an important skill that we need as professionals, but it's also an important life skill for everyone going through what we're all going through at this time, no matter who you are. So I think resilience is an absolutely important piece. And last but not least, Sultan, your views on this evening and any kind of final thoughts?
Yeah, so I think, because I work a lot with technology companies and basically technology startups, and there are lots of examples of innovation hubs where people can share ideas, can get support, can get new ideas, can think of new paradigms and so on. But I wonder if that's just too limited just to tech companies, because I think going forward, all companies are going to have to innovate, and I wonder whether we should consider whether there's additional mechanisms that we can take from the tech field that can apply to small businesses, because I've heard a lot of good ideas. For example, Nicola came up with some good ideas on how to run real estate companies through this crisis. So I wonder if there's something we as a group can do there which will help all of the different SMEs and so on. So that's I'm leaving it more with a question rather than a comment, but I think that's where I'd probably leave it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much. And I think from my perspective, firstly, can I say thank you to everyone who's been on the call, and it's been an absolute honor and a privilege just to hear the thoughts and to share the cross-learning and the different perspectives in a real honest, open and transparent environment. And that's what makes the world it is, without getting all philosophical about it. But I think that's what drives change. So thank you very much. So as you probably noticed as we're talking, I've been making loads of various different notes on the various different points. And so please allow me just to kind of sum up some closing thoughts really, and just to leave them with you. And I think from what I've heard from all speakers and all the questions and all of you as the participants this evening, what's become very, very clear is the notion that change is here. This isn't about recovery to change per se. It is about the fact that change is here and change will be continual. Whilst the name escapes me, but there was a quote made by someone who said that the only thing that's constant in life is change. And we're certainly going through that right now. But that change in itself, dependent upon how that change is affecting you, is change that is needed. It's change that is unwanted, and it's change that is welcomed. And depending on what day of the week or how many Zoom calls you've done in a day, that you could flip between all those three pillars. And there'll probably be more. But from what I'm hearing this evening is that change is affecting people in different ways. And those are the three ways that I'm hearing is giving people a realization that they now need to do something. They now need to take action. They now need to step forward in some positive way. But I think with whatever step you take, what I'm also hearing that within that, there's this sense of value and this inherent desire to make sure that you're still adding value, and adding value from a social perspective. So obviously, Steve, Barbara, the way that you do, Tina, what you do in terms of the social aspect, and others here on the call in terms of the social value that you provide through what you do. There's certainly a need to continually making sure that you're asking yourself what that actually means to the people you're trying to provide that to, and refining that where necessary, or indeed enhancing that where you may need to. The economic value, at a system level, banking, access to finance, equity models, right down to charitable use of finance, funding, innovation within business models. All these things are challenging the way in which our very society, I was going to say society runs, but it's not always about the economic and capital drivers. But certainly in the society that we're living in, capitalism is certainly an important driver for change, and we need to be aware of how that affects the economics and the environment that we're a part of. And also business value in itself. What does it mean to be in business in 2020? What does it really mean? What's the purpose? What are you really trying to do? And how is this vehicle of a business helping you to achieve that? And how are you validating that purpose is correct, or that purpose is the same purpose that you started out with at the beginning of the year? So redefining or even repurposing value is really important. And I guess my final piece around this is the business of you. And what I mean by that is business is a vehicle for change, right? In terms of transferring value to someone who's going to pay you for it, etc., or creating the social value that, where there's a need to do so. But I think within that, there are a number of key words that I've also heard this evening that relate to business, but also create to you as an individual. And that's resilience, as Nicola highlighted there, and the importance of keeping going. You know, the greatest achievements have been made by people who've refused to accept their failures as failures. They saw them as learning experiences. So that resilience is really, really important. The innovation, going back to Sultan and Manda, what you talked about in terms of innovation leading to diversity, but also equality. But how innovation is used is really, really important. But understanding what it means to you. The resources that you have. So we talked about finance, we talked about networks, we talked about people. Resources important, but how are you using those resources? How are you maximizing the benefit of those resources? How are you multiplying the value of those resources? So there's a question there around that. And good old-fashioned accountability. We could have the greatest ideas in the world and the greatest thoughts and the greatest passion. Well, who's holding us accountable for the outcome? Who's holding us accountable for the impacts? Who are you holding accountable for the things that people say they're going to do in your organization or in your networks or in the community that we are all here to serve? So the business of you is very, very important because we all have a part to play. So that's kind of my general summing up and thoughts really. But I think overarchingly, personal change is important. And if we're not controlling that and being aware of that and embracing that, then we won't be able to deliver the value that we know that we can all deliver, no matter which way we choose to do so. So I just want to hand back to Deirdre just to close off for this evening. But thank you much for taking the time out of your busy days and evenings to be a part of the Lunar Society today. And thank you very much for giving me the time to support you with that. It's Deirdre.
Thank you, Joel. Gosh, this has just been such an incredible, wonderful, enlightening, engaging event. I've not had so much fun on a computer in a long time. Don't take that in any other way. So I just want to say thank you so much to the incredible panelists. You have all been so transparent and open and vulnerable in your deliveries and so professional as well. We are so honored that you agreed to speak to us at the Lunar Society on this topic. And just to answer Joel's question about what do I think I need to change in order to respond to the change, in all honesty, I mean, this has been quite an interesting and difficult season. And we spoke about inequalities, and the types of inequalities that have reared their heads during this COVID season are close to me. One being domestic abuse and another being Black Lives Matter. And I think one of the things that I would change, and I had to really challenge myself, is to have courage, to speak with authenticity, and to not be afraid and to be unapologetic about my views, because in embracing myself as a diverse individual, my diversity of experience can impact the value to society. So courage is what I'll be adding on to my repertoire. I would actually also want to invite anyone who is not a member of the Lunar Society. We would love to have you with us, honestly. It's, as you can see, we are such an amazing set of people. We're all very good looking. And, and in addition to that, we are truly people who care about society, and our mission is to advance society. So it'd be wonderful for you to be a part of us. And lastly, I would like us to thank our incredible chair, this chair who has brought us on a journey. And I would invite you all to unmute, actually, and to clap in the usual fashion as if we were all together, so we can hear the claps for Joel J.